Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chip Gibbons. I am the Policy Director of Defending Rights and Dissent. It is 3 o'clock here in Washington, D.C. It is noon on the West Coast, where 2 of our panelists are joining us. And it is 9 o'clock p.m. in Italy, where another one of our panelists are joining us. Last week, on January the 6th, we saw a really rather terrifying scene in Washington, D.C., when a group of people, sort of animated by the former president, with these sorts of false claims of electoral fraud, somehow managed to storm the Capitol, despite it being one of the most heavily guarded buildings in the U.S., with the intent of stopping the constitutionally mandated counting of electoral votes and installing the loser of an election as the winner of the election. This has raised many questions about what were the police doing, why did they treat people so disparately than sort of the racial justice protests we saw over the summer. And we've also unfortunately heard calls for a new domestic terrorism law for restriction of the right to protest and other restrictions of civil liberties. So here to wade through all of these very messy issues today, we have assembled a all-star panel, including Alice Sperry, who is joining us from Italy. Alice is a reporter at The Intercept, where she writes about the criminal justice system and civil rights. We are joined by Michael German. Michael is, of course, a fellow at the Law and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University Law School. He also is a former FBI agent, a former ACLU lobbyist, and the author of the book Disrupt, Discredit, Divide: How the New FBI Damages Democracy, which is behind me somewhere on my bookshelf, and I meant to grab before this so I could hold it up like this. Highly recommend Mike's book. You should read it. We're then joined by Iman Bukadum, who is the senior manager of the Fighting Hate and Bias program at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And last but not least, we are joined by Arun Gupta, who is an investigative journalist who has written for The Intercept, The Daily Beast, The Washington Post, The Nation, and most importantly of all, is a board member of Defending Rights and Dissent. Thank you all for joining me this afternoon, everyone. Or evening if you're in Italy.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So the first question I want to start with is a bit of a meta question. How do we even talk about what happened at the Capitol on January the 6th? I know for people who are in the protest rights sort of world and circle, there's a real effort to be intentional about using language that won't reverberate against protesters, so to make clear what happened at the Capitol is not a protest. Some people have been very adamant that they should call the people who sort of stormed the Capitol domestic terrorist or domestic extremist, whereas other people, including us at Defending Rights and Dissent, have been very sort of opposed to this language of domestic terrorism, given the way that it's been used to sort of demonize and criminalize the Muslim and Arab American community, attack dissent. So I guess, what's the type of language we should use to describe what happened on January the 6th and what happened on January the 6th? Alice, would you like to start us off with this easy question?
I mean, it's not an easy question. I mean, I feel like a lot of the words that we have been completely kind of taken out of context and politicized in the past few years in a way that's kind of, co-opted their meaning and turned it into something else. So I've personally tried to describe what happened on January 6th in the most just kind of plain descriptive term as possible. I've called it the storming of the Capitol for the most part. I am certainly very wary of some of the words that people have used, terrorism being one of them. I mean, I think terrorism is a word that just does not mean anything anymore, really. It's just been used in so many problematic ways that I just try not to use it basically ever. But it's it's interesting. I was actually talking to colleagues. As you mentioned, I'm in Italy, and the front page in the main newspaper in Italy called what happened a coup, which it's not quite a coup. But that's definitely the way it was perceived in countries that kind of had a history of fearing political coups. So yeah, I mean, I haven't quite settled on a final word, but I tend to describe it as the storming of the Capitol.
We have used in our literature both coup and now insurrection, but insurrection was definitely a word chosen by committee. Mike, how would you describe what happened on the 6th?
I also try to avoid the use of the word
terrorism or just at least when I use it, make clear that it's a political term and you can't depoliticize a political term. So it's problematic when we talk about it in a law enforcement context. The terms that we have focused on in the last three reports that the Brennan Center put out on this topic, it was white supremacists and far-right militancy, right? Mm-hmm. Because we want to make sure we're focused on the violence, the militancy, and not any ideologies, the extremism, for example. We find a problematic term because it takes away from what should be a law enforcement focus on the violence. But of course, I especially as a white cisgendered male, I recognize that for communities that have been saddled with that label for so long, having a debate about what we call the perpetrator when they happen to be white or promoting a white supremacist cause, I understand why that's grating and we need to address it. But I think the way we address it is by taking that language out of our legal lexicon rather than perpetuating it into other fields that allow it to be misused by law enforcement.
Excellent. And Arun, how would you answer the question?
Well, my opinion is it was an insurrection. It was clearly an attempted coup. When you look at, just quickly the whole QAnon angle of it, right? They called it storming the Capitol, and the storm has very specific meaning, which is that Trump is his enemies are going to be captured, and he is going to personally execute them. And so when he said, I'm going to walk with you down Pennsylvania Avenue, the thing about Trump is I've been saying for 5 years he's a genius. He's a genius at being a demagogue and manipulating media, people's emotions. So when he said that was his kind of signal that the storm was coming. And it has been reported that he is very well versed in the intricacies of QAnon conspiracy. And so we saw, people armed. We saw them go in. They were looking for congressional members. They were chanting, hang Mike Pence. We've all seen the videos of just those absolutely pitched battles that the police have described like medieval siege warfare. And I know for a lot of people, they feel there's something comical about it, right? Because of the element of cosplay and all the costumes and just how ridiculous it is. And that's true, but it's a joke until the joke is on you. As far as terrorism, sure, I agree. It's a meaningless term. I believe after 9/11, like Reuters even made the decision not to use terrorism because it is basically a meaningless term. But at the same time, I also understand why there's a rhetorical use of it from the left, which is to make the point that, hey, if you're going to call, Islamic militants terrorists, then why aren't we calling these Christian militants terrorists?
Iman.
Thank you so much for having me, Chip, and thank you so much to my colleagues for joining us today, and to everybody who's listening in. I'm a huge fan of this podcast, so this is kind of like a dream come true. So my name is Iman Bukadum, as Chip mentioned, and I lead our immigration coalition at the Leadership Conference, and also work on fighting hate and bias and fighting white supremacy. And the Leadership Conference is over 220 organizations, and in the civil rights and civil liberties space. And I think the way that we've been messaging this point is, I think, in two ways. The first point is to absolutely not use the domestic terrorism framing, no matter how well-intentioned, as my colleague Arun just articulated. I think a lot of people on the left want to say, well, violence is violence, and if it's white supremacist or white nationalist violence, then it should be called terrorism. The problem with that is that it further entrenches a lot of the counterterrorism tools that have been disproportionately used against communities like mine, Arab Muslim communities. And so no matter how well-intentioned it is, we generally advise against using that framework. But what we do call the folks that engaged, in attacking the Capitol on January 6th is, white nationalist insurrectionists. And we always remind people that this is not new. The issue of white supremacy and violence coming from white supremacists is not something that, while shocking and perhaps, dramatic in its manifestation on January 6th, it certainly is not the first time that these violent white nationalist groups, who are very well organized, well funded, and have been around for a long time, since the inception of our nation, have done things like these.
Those are all good points, give us a lot to think about. So we recently witnessed over the summer sort of protracted demonstrations against racism and police violence that respond by the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, who were both killed by police. When people would gather nonviolently to protest the police, we would see these militarized police responses. We saw stories like National Guard shooting rubber bullets at people on their porches. I know when I was in DC at the White House, I saw the DC police firing flashbang grenades and tear gas or some sort of other chemical irritant. I guess it was pepper spray, not tear gas. Pretty recklessly around. And obviously, I don't condone that type of behavior from law enforcement. But when people saw the sort of insurrectionist or would-be coup mongers, whatever you want to call them, gather at the Capitol and storm it, people were very shocked by the seemingly disparate treatment of the Capitol Hill insurrectionists compared to left-wing or racial justice protesters. The point where even commentators on CNN talking in real time had to acknowledge this fact. What do we think of this distinction between how they were treated? And I guess I'll start with Arun, since I know you've written a lot about the dynamic in Portland, where there have been attacks on left-wing protesters, not just by police, but far-right groups as well. And so I think you probably have some good insights here.
Yeah, I think, one of the main things we need to think about is just the structure, and there is widespread impunity that conservative white violence enjoys in American society, and really this America is built on that, right? Native genocide and African chattel slavery. I think a number of people pointed to the fact that this insurrection came hours after Ralph Warnock was elected as the first black senator ever from Georgia. And of course, Trump had been attacking particularly cities, heavily the vote in cities. And so there's this history of every time there's a mass black political and social mobilization, there's a violent white backlash, right? It goes back to slave rebellions, Reconstruction, Great Migration, civil rights, Obama, and the Black Lives Matter movement that Trump mobilizes a white backlash to it. But overall, there's been this phenomena that we've seen, and I think it really starts with the Bundys, the latest phase, the Clive and Bundy standoff in Nevada in 2014. And under the guise of First Amendment freedoms, the government and police give wide berth and impunity to far-right violence. And at the same time, under the guise of public safety, the government and police violently repress left-leaning freedom of assembly and protest. And we saw, there were studies that came out that said 93% of Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd's death were peaceful. And even those that were, quote unquote, not peaceful, the vast majority of them just involved some basically relatively minor property destruction. But in Portland, and I can go into this more if you want, what we've seen is kind of this systematic impunity. But really, it's hard not to conclude that there's even kind of outright collusion and assistance that the police have created to enable far-right violence that is then used to suppress left-wing protest, First Amendment protected activity.
So, Mike, I want to turn to you next because, like I mentioned at the beginning, you were an FBI agent, and what you were involved in was infiltrating white national, I believe, neo-Nazi groups. You also have written a report about what you call explicit bias in law enforcement, which is law enforcement ties to far-right white supremacist groups. How does that sort of background influence your thinking on what happened with the disparate treatment of the Capitol Hill insurrectionists? And what do you think when you see these images of Capitol Hill police taking selfies with the people who have just stormed the Capitol?
Well, I guess the one benefit of being old is that you see things in context with events that have happened in the past, and that's what's frustrating about a lot of the response to the assault on the Capitol is that we're talking about it in many, particularly policymakers in the FBI and in the U.S. Attorney's Office, as if that was a sui generis event that has opened our eyes to this problem, when anybody who has eyes could have seen this happening all across the country for the past 4 years. That these white supremacists and far-right militant groups engaging in public violence with very little interference from state and local law enforcement officers who are often on the scene and yet not addressing the violence, or any interference from the FBI when they travel interstate to engage in this violence, as they have been doing over the last couple of years. So, when I went undercover in the 1990s, people imagine that, oh, that was a period when the FBI was more aggressively targeting white supremacist violence, but it actually isn't true. Those cases that I worked were only successful because there were very effective case agents who were skilled and persistent in getting over all the bureaucratic obstacles that were put in front of them to get those cases started. And once they were successful, of course, everybody was happy to claim credit for it and to pat themselves on the back, but it didn't start any kind of comprehensive effort to address this violence in a larger way, or even capture the intelligence that we had gathered during those undercover operations. So this has been a long-standing issue. The last report I wrote for the Brennan Center focused, as you said, on the influence of white supremacy, racism, and far-right militancy within law enforcement. And that's never been hidden, right? Law enforcement knows about it. Certainly the communities that they police know about it. But there's just never been a national effort to actually address it. And in fact, when the FBI put me undercover, they warned me and the Joint Terrorism Task Force officers that were working on the investigation to be very discreet in how we shared the information among law enforcement, because there was a recognition that there were sympathies for these militant and white supremacist ideas within law enforcement, and that has been documented in materials that have been released since. So it's frustrating to hear them talk about how difficult it will be moving forward, that, how are we going to monitor every police officer's social media and all that, where that's not the issue. All they have to do is talk to the agents who work with those police officers every day. Talk to the police officers, right? How many Capitol Police have come forward and said, yes, we've been screaming about racism and discrimination within the Capitol Police for decades, and nobody's been paying attention to it. So it's just a matter of seeing what is in plain sight and dealing with it. The FBI has authority to investigate civil rights violations under color of law, which is by police officers, police brutality, and other activities, and yet the vast majority of those cases are not accepted. They're declined for prosecution because those investigations tend to be very pro forma rather than actually opportunities to go in and investigate the persistent racism within these police departments.
I mean, go on.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go on.
And of course, the FBI remains a very white male organization. So, the attitudes of the average white or the average FBI agent fit in line with the political ideas of white male, which disproportionately favored Trump and supported Trump. So they find themselves on the same side on the issues with many of these groups. And we know from human nature and many social science and psychological experience that you tend to view people who are more like you as less threatening. So if they see themselves in these far-right militants, that's why they might see them as less threatening.
Yeah, and the problem goes back decades. I mean, we do a podcast called Still Spying about the history of FBI political surveillance. You were one of our guests, Mike. Alicia was another one of our guests. And we did a whole episode on the FBI Ku Klux Klan informant in the 60s, Gary Rowe, who is a very creepy figure who was present when a civil rights activist, Viola Luzo, was murdered. But in doing some of the research for the podcast, I mean, I was just struck by some of these stories, like where the FBI tips off the highway patrol that this Klan informant and these Klansmen are going to carry out an attack on, I believe, a local college. And when the state trooper pulls them over, he warns them that they have an informant in their midst, trying to out the informant. He warns Gary Rowe, of course, not realizing Gary Rowe is the informant. And if you go back to the Church Committee report where they're talking about the decision to open a counterintelligence program on the Klan, right? Part of the rationale from Robert F. Kennedy was just that local law enforcement in the South was so in bed with the Klan that there was just no avenue to prosecute anyone or do normal law enforcement tactics. Alicia, you've written a lot about how the FBI and sort of other government agencies have responded to the Black Lives Matter movement, including this really sort of disturbing Black identity extremism assessment. What's your takeaway from how we watched the Capitol Police respond to the insurrection versus what you've seen in your reporting on how they've treated Black Lives Matter protesters?
Right. So, I mean, first of all, one of the things, we say when we talk about what happened on January 6th is, how shocking it was. And I think it really should not be all that shocking at all. I mean, we had, first of all, the event itself should not be shocking because it was planned in plain sight. But also, the different response from police and then later from prosecutors should also not surprise us because we see that all the time in our criminal justice system. So I think, it's absolutely important to talk about that. I wrote something recently comparing, not just the police response, but the immediate charges that were filed against the individuals who attacked the Capitol in comparison to people who were arrested and charged, violently arrested and charged immediately with really severe crimes during the George Floyd uprising last summer, during the J20 protests on Trump's inauguration, and over the last several years. I mean, we've seen prosecutors really go out of their way to charge people with extremely harsh federal charges for doing things that are, far less than what we saw on January 6th. And I think there's a danger in comparing January 6th to the J20 protests or the George Floyd uprising, because they are not remotely comparable as acts. Even where crimes were committed, they are just not, on the same level. But of course, the most immediate response so many of us had was, just looking at the different way police and then prosecutors were treating them. But I think one important point to make, for instance, about the J20 is that, the people that were arrested on Trump's inauguration, the groups that had organized this protest had been infiltrated and targeted and surveilled for months before it. We know that there has been an enormous amount of time and resources and man hours that were just manpower and hours that were put into the surveillance of Black activists since Ferguson, obviously well before that, but certainly since Ferguson and through the protests of the last few years. And so, the FBI even went out of their way to really kind of come up with this absolutely non-existent ideology, right? This Black identity extremism that they literally invented and spent all this time kind of trying to target people based on that, when we knew and they knew that all this violence by far-right white supremacist groups was there. They had all the evidence they needed. And and they didn't really put those kinds of resources there. So now we're seeing, you know, the FBI and DOJ prosecutors talk about how they're going to really go all out in their charges against the people who attacked the Capitol, and kind of, you know, bring this really severe charges, which, by the way, they have not yet. But and I think in a way it's kind of like an effort to make up to their just like colossal failure building up to January 6th. But then I also think it's very problematic because we're already seeing how that's being turned and, you know, into a call for not just more domestic terrorism laws, but also just greater powers and kind of mass conspiracy prosecutions, which I've written a lot about and are just like, you know, really, really problematic, not because I kind of, you know, hold any sympathies for these guys, but because once they're used and validated, they will continue to be used as they have in the past against, you know, protesters and people of color and the people that are just kind of like, you know, facing the injustices of the criminal legal system anyway. So yeah, I mean, I can't see you. So, I think, you know, I think it's important that we like absolutely talk about the differences in which, you know, the differences we saw in the treatment of the people at the Capitol, and definitely in the prosecution we'll see. I mean, we know a lot of people are out on bail, which is barely afforded to, like, you know, most criminal defendants in this country on any given day. So we definitely need to talk about that. But I think it's really dangerous to also call for the kind of legal response that will ultimately just kind of be used against many other groups that are already dealing with that.
And in a minute, I want to return to the topic of a new domestic terrorism law, which is sort of the elephant in the room for this entire conversation, as well as the J20 charges, which you've written about in relationship to the Capitol Hill insurrection. We'll get to that next. Iman, how did you react to sort of the disparate treatment? I know the leadership conference has been very concerned with police reform, and you've probably seen these protests for police reform met with police violence. So watching what happened, what was your reaction?
Well, I think, unfortunately, it wasn't surprising. You know, racial justice, or racial injustice, I should say, and white supremacy in particular, infect law enforcement, and they also infect our politics and the way in which the resources and in the way the resources and powers are deployed to clamp down against violence, right? So the reality is that violence happens in all communities. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Sorry. You know, violence happens in many communities, but for some reason, or not for some reason, because of white supremacy, because of racial injustice, we see the FBI, local law enforcement, and Homeland Security aggressively over-policing Black communities in particular, especially protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters, and others, environmental protesters, and also over-policing Muslim and Arab communities. So Palestinian activists, for example, I know last week you all had a very prominent Arab American activist on your podcast, and this is nothing new to Arab communities, Muslim communities, or to Black communities. Martin Luther King, you know, we were celebrating him on Monday and commemorating him. He was spied on, and he is the most peaceful, peace-loving person you could ever think of. So the reality is that white supremacy infects the lens through which law enforcement and policymakers see the issue of violence and where resources are deployed and what should be prioritized. Is often done in a racially unfair way. And so what we saw with Black Lives Matter protesters who were by and large very peaceful, unarmed, you know, the worst crimes that we saw were really property crimes, right? Nothing even close to the insurrection that we saw on Capitol Hill, where they were literally calling for Mike Pence's head. I mean, it's not even comparable what happened, but the clampdown against Black Lives Matter activists was vicious, was disproportionate, and was aggressive, and it was psychological too. It was to signal to racial justice advocates that white supremacy is here to stay because it infects, like I said, the political, legal, and also law enforcement systems that we live in. So this is a really systemic issue that was just glaring. And I was somewhat heartened to see that some in the media did flag this disparity because it was so egregious. But it also saddens us at the Leadership Conference that it takes these kinds of extreme acts to really wake America up.
Thank you for that. And the podcast reference, that was Abdeen Jabbar, who came on the Still Spying podcast. Abdeen Jabbar was the past president of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, where you used to work. And he was spied on by both the FBI and the NSA, and he was the first American person ever named by name to have been spied on by the National Security Agency. This was in the 70s, not after 9/11. This was in the 70s as part of this clampdown on Arab American civil society that happened in the wake of the 6 Days War in this country, and existed for decades and only got worse with 9/11. And you mentioned the Palestine protesters. I mean, I spent half a decade getting the FBI to release its files on the International Solidarity Movement, a nonviolent pro-Palestinian a group. And when you looked at sort of the files where they were explaining what they had done to make them terrorist, I mean, in one of the documents, it literally cites the fact that they have anti-capitalist views, anti-globe views. I believe they mean anti-globalization, not flat Earth views, but I don't ever know with the FBI, and that they were sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, all of which is First Amendment protected speech. And yet, you know, the FBI viewed this as grounds to spy on people. And I would note that some of the language about anti-capitalism and anti-globe is very similar to the language that's in the FBI's document that's still on its website about anarchist extremists. They're inspired by anti-capitalism and anti-globe views. So Alicia, I want to return to you because you mentioned the J20 incident, something that I wrote about in The Nation and covered the trial a lot for Defending Rights Dissent Newswire, where we saw sort of 214 people arrested en masse during the Trump inauguration, including 2 journalists. They were then all put on trial using this sort of ridiculous conspiracy liability logic. You know, because you were at this protest, you were therefore guilty of all these other bad acts. And the elements of the conspiracy were things like chanting "Whose streets are streets" and moving in the same direction. So, you know, basically a protest. And in your last piece for The Intercept, you've written about how, you know, we don't want to see those types of charges brought against the Capitol Hill insurrectionists. And while I think many people watching would support some sort of prosecution of those people, you've warned about how some of the charges could have a really deleterious effect on civil liberties and backfire against others. Could you talk a little bit about what type of prosecution you don't want to see and why that's so troubling?
Yeah. So first of all, to be clear, I absolutely support prosecutions. I think there were obviously crimes that were committed, and we have plenty of laws to address the crimes that were committed. I think in an effort to kind of overcompensate for their failures, we saw, you know, last week, DOJ and FBI officials basically say they're going to build these like mass conspiracy cases that, you know, they threatened to bring charges like, you know, seditious conspiracy, felony murder, which, you know, are extremely just like harsh and really problematic in provisions really that have like sent people to prison for life, or, you know, put people on death row over murders they did not commit. So there was definitely this language that I think was, you know, was there in an effort to show that the FBI and the DOJ were now going to do what, you know, they had not been doing up until that day, up until that moment. But I think one thing that you mentioned with the J20, one thing that, you know, as someone that covers the criminal justice system a lot, really just troubled me was the call for mass conspiracy prosecutions. And mass conspiracy is just like really, you know, conspiracy laws were really developed as an effort to go after organized crime, like the mafia in the 70s, right? They were meant to go after sophisticated criminal networks that had all the resources and organizations that, you know, that they, you know, all the money that they needed to kind of commit massive crimes. I mean, some of the most, you know, well-known people that were convicted on conspiracy charges were like, John Gotti and mobsters back in the 70s. In the last several years, we've seen the same kinds of federal conspiracy charges being brought increasingly against people of color, a lot of alleged gang members. I wrote this story a couple years ago about this really just tragic mass gang prosecution in the Bronx, where 120 people were arrested and all, accused of committing a handful of murders that some of them had committed and some of them were already serving state time for. And everyone just got dragged into this, massive federal conspiracy case. And because it was poor defendants, they all ended up taking pleas, or 99% of them ended up taking pleas, which is definitely not something that we're going to see in the assault on the Capitol. But the J20 case is another good example, right? You had 200 people, more than 200 people, including, as you said, journalists and legal observers and people that were just like there, who all got charged together with conspiracy rioting, right? And their lives were put on hold for a year and a half. They were facing decades in prison, and prosecutors lost those cases. There were a few acquittals and mistrials, and then they ended up dropping charges against everybody else. But that really sent a chilling message that maybe a few people in the crowd did commit crimes. Everyone that was in the vicinity is going to be held accountable the same level. And so I think that's what I think is going to be that's what I think will be very problematic in the January 6th case. I also think that what we risk seeing is a prosecution of all the people who are at the Capitol, and some of them, most of them deserve prosecution, and I think some of them deserve some serious charges. But we're not really seeing any conspiracy charges brought against the people that incited them, the people that organized them, that the people that kind of really rallied them to go there. And so I think there's a risk, in kind of building or criminalizing these people beyond the crimes they committed, without actually holding the people that are most responsible for what happened accountable. And so I think there's absolutely a need for accountability that I think will need to come from, at various levels. As someone who covers the criminal justice system, I just am very skeptical that the justice system can give that much accountability. And I think, more of it will need to come at the political level. There were obviously a number of elected officials who really encouraged, if not the storming of the Capitol and the attack on the Capitol itself, then at least the beliefs of the people that went there. But then, again, the differences that we were talking about before will also be there. When you have mass conspiracy charges brought against alleged gang members in the Bronx, you're talking about poor defendants that are not really getting, a fair shot. They're usually not making it to a trial. I think we'll see a very different case, a different situation here. We will see a lot of trials, and I think, probably really solid defense brought on behalf of some of the people that attacked the Capitol. And so, the system is not fair and equal, and it will not be throughout. But I think that kind of calling for the same kinds of tactics that already do so much damage really risks backfiring and sort of validating them.
And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the prosecutor during the J20 case, Jennifer Kirkhoff, whose Brady violation got basically the case and got a promotion. And that was also not the first time she had a Brady violation. She's actually quite well known. A Brady is failure to disclose exculpating evidence to the defense. It is supposed to be a faux pas in the criminal justice system, but apparently you can be a career prosecutor who is best known for doing that often and not have it impact your career. Mike, do you think there's a risk that if in the way we prosecute the people engaged in the Capitol 6 insurrection, if it's an abusive prosecutor, that it has the prosecution or sort of goes too far, it has sort of long-term ramifications for civil liberties?
I think it does. I mean, what we need to do is make sure that law enforcement is focused on people they have evidence to believe are engaged in wrongdoing, and not people who are thinking things or associating with people but otherwise not involved in the misconduct. And that's the problem, is that as we keep broadening who gets targeted by law enforcement or empowering what we're acknowledging is a structurally racist system, the outcomes are going to be far worse for the communities that are always treated as suspects. And that's just communities of color, immigrants, and political dissidents. So we have to be careful that we're not expanding a problematic system rather than narrowing it. And you know, it's important to hold law enforcement to account, because it's not just the disparity in treatment at the event. And you know, we're hearing this rhetoric now that they're going to be more aggressive, but there was some charges against an individual last night that came out where the news articles and the complaint made clear this was somebody that the U.S. attorney was saying, this is somebody who laid hands on a police officer. They have evidence that this isn't just somebody who, you know, was trespassing in a restricted space. This person actually harmed a law enforcement officer, or attempted to. But when you read the material, the FBI called him at home and said, would you please come down and turn yourself in and bring your phone? Now, we've all seen cases where somebody is alleged to have assaulted a police officer, and typically they're not calling them on the phone and asking them to please bring the evidence of your crime to us, right? So, you know, I think it's important that we make sure law enforcement is focusing on the right people, right? We've seen some indictments of the leaders of at least one section of the Proud Boys. And even in those indictments, they seem to be suggesting that the Proud Boys are a political group that at times certain individuals engage in violence, rather than acknowledging the history of this group, right? This is sort of an outlier, because its founder made very clear that he was organizing a violent group, that his intention was for this group to engage in violence at protests. And so they're a violent group that happens to engage in much of its violence in public protest, but also has members who engaged in violence long before there was a group, and outside of the context of these public protests. So in the indictments, again, you see them looking at the January 6th incident as if it was out of nowhere, rather than recognizing these individuals and this particular group has been involved in active violence all across the country. And this wasn't an accident that they showed up at this rally. This was part of their publicly stated intention. So, you know, my fear is that where the FBI is now, they don't want to admit those past failures. So they're pretending that January 5th backwards didn't exist, that the violence that occurred during those protests, including 2 protests in DC in the 2 months preceding this attack. So it's not as if they didn't have a heads up that these groups were a potential problem. It's really hard to understand how they're doing that.
Yeah, and I do know there is some concern about making sure we distinguish between people who came to DC that day for the Trump rally, which, whether or not we think that was foolishness or not, is protected, versus people who came and engaged in an insurrection, which is very different than just foolishness. I know Iman has a hard 4 o'clock cutoff, and I want to ask her a question about a leadership conference letter, but I just want to give Arun a real quick chance to weigh in on whether there's a risk in the way we prosecute these people, if it sort of furthers prosecutorial abuse that could come back to haunt other people.
Well, I think the risk comes with passing new laws, you know, and I think we should also maybe look at this as an opportunity to push back on that accessory murder, you know, how that is used. But at the same time, I think, you know, and I'll just be quick, but I'd like to expand on this after Imam speaks. There's the disparity in policing, and this gets back to my original point about how there's just this incredible leeway given to far-right violence under the guise of protest, and then state violence used against peaceful left-wing protest. And Portland and Oregon, you know, first with the Bundys, and then what we've seen over the last 4 years with the Portland has essentially become an alt-right fight club, right? And, you know, what Mike was referring to was Gavin McInnes saying, we're a gang, we will kill you, about about the Proud Boys. Gavin McInnes is a founder of the Proud Boys, and also their initiation rituals include beating up members, and then they have degrees, and fourth degree, the highest degree, is for violence, for getting into a street fight and either getting hurt or hurting an anti-fascist on behalf of the Proud Boys. And so I think there's an argument to be made for using RICO against the Proud Boys. They are nothing more than a violent criminal gang who raise money to go and attack people in cities around the country.
So I think the big elephant in the room, and the thing we've all alluded to multiple times, is this idea of a new domestic terrorism law. Iman, the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights has just put out a letter opposing a new domestic terrorism law. I know Defending Rights in Dissent was on the letter. I think Brennan might have been as well. Okay, Brennan was on it.
Sure.
So could you explain to us why the Leadership Conference opposes a new domestic terrorism law?
Sure. The reason why we oppose a domestic terrorism law or any sentencing enhancement whatsoever is because we know that Black and Brown communities are going to be the ones that are going to suffer even more than they already suffer. My colleagues on this podcast have already extensively spoken about the ways that the criminal legal system is infected with racism, the disparate treatment, the way that Black communities and Brown communities are over-policed, how their protests are treated differently, while, as Mike just said earlier, the Proud Boys are, the violence that they engage in is completely decontextualized and treated as, and each person is treated as an individual instead of them being treated as this organized violent gang, which should be prosecuted under RICO, as Arun just, very eloquently said. So the reality is that there is no need for additional authorities. The FBI already has vast authority. And as Alicia just said, the conspiracy statutes that we have, the material support for terrorism statutes that we have, are so broad that there is absolutely no reason for additional authorities, national security authorities or otherwise, because we already have, we would argue, too many authorities that over-criminalize people in this country, particularly communities of color, Black, Brown, Muslim, Arab, South Asian, and other protesters who are allies. And so we think that not only do we have a really, not only does the FBI and the national security state and the police state have tremendous authority to investigate and put those who actually did engage in acts of violence against, again, we don't believe in thought policing. If you think certain things that are odious, that's not enough to put you in jail. But if you're engaging in violent activities that are, subverting the, democratic process, then certainly that should be prosecuted and treated as a crime. But there are a wealth of authorities that they can use. And we think it's extremely dangerous for the federal government and Congress in particular to, in a knee-jerk in this sort of reactionary way, pass additional national security authorities, because we've seen historically, when there's this moment of crisis, Congress tends to pass really bad legislation like the '94 crime bill, which has led to the greatest carceral state in the world, where Black communities have been decimated, or the Patriot Act, which was, which has destroyed Black, Brown, Muslim, Arab communities, where we basically have no privacy rights. I don't feel comfortable going to the mosque because I know that there's FBI informants everywhere. And anything I say is going to be used against me, even if it is innocuous. So I think that we are in a moment right now where we really have to push back against any kind of overreaction. And we know the solution, right? The solution is for the executive branch, right? Prosecutorial discretion, and for prosecutors to actually use those resources to investigate white nationalists like the Proud Boys, like the 3%ers and others who are very open about their hatred for communities of color and who are very open about their love for violence. So all we're asking for is just redirecting those resources that have been used disproportionately against my community and others, and go ahead and redirect those resources against, these violent white nationalists. And I think that then we'll be able to actually have a safer society.
Those are all really excellent points. And a lot of people talk about how the Patriot Act was passed after 9/11, but after the Oklahoma City bombing, which was a domestic terrorism attack carried out by Timothy McVeigh, a far-right militant, or whatever you want to call him, Congress pushed through the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, which in a lot of ways is the precursor to the Patriot Act. A lot of the provisions in it had been already floating around in legislative proposals in Congress in response to the 93 World Trade Center attack. A lot of them were from the sort of Heritage Foundation wish list from the 80s as sort of tools they wanted the FBI to have to go after opponents of Ronald Reagan's Central America policy. And then the other part of that, the effective death penalty part of that, was, of course, quote unquote habeas corpus reform, definitely in heavy quotation marks, basically taking away the rights of people on death row to appeal their sentences. And we saw that bill play out in really a disturbing way around the innocence case around Troy Davis, a death row prisoner who many people believe to be actually innocent, who was executed by the state of Georgia. Mike, you've done a pretty thorough review of the U.S.'s terrorism laws and how they apply domestically. What did you find out? Is there actually a shortage of laws that the government can use to go after domestic terrorism? I hear that every time I turn on CNN, so it must be true, Mike, right?
Right, and I have to say that the reporting around this topic has been awful, with some exceptions, like The Intercept did a number of stories on it, but and the other thing to keep in mind, that this push for a broad new domestic terrorism law started under the Obama administration. And what I kept hearing was this idea there isn't a domestic terrorism law, when that is absolutely false. Obviously, I worked undercover as an FBI special agent in domestic terrorism cases against white supremacists in the 1990s. Nobody back then suggested that we didn't have a law. Of course not. We've had the Ku Klux Klan in the United States for an awful long time, and we've developed a number of laws to address the kind of violence that they perpetrate, and like-minded groups. So what I endeavored to do is document the many laws. Number one, the idea that there is not a domestic terrorism law is only true if you acknowledge there is also no international terrorism law. There's no organized crime law, because those two words don't fit in the title of some statute, which is absurd, because of course there are dozens of terrorism laws. The Material Support for Terrorism statute that again passed in 1996 was part of what they did was identify the 57 federal crimes of terrorism that are pertinent to that material support statute. And so there are 57 federal crimes of terrorism, 51 of which have always applied to domestic terrorism. And the Material Support for Terrorism statute itself has also been used in domestic terrorism cases. It's rarely used in domestic terrorism cases because conspiracy statutes overlap with that conduct and are easier for prosecutors to apply. So the idea that there is some gap is simply false, and simply ignores how law enforcement addresses these crimes, because the whole purpose of a joint terrorism task force is to incorporate state and local law enforcement, so that when there is some perpetrator whose acts don't rise to the level of a federal prosecution, you can also prosecute him in state or local courts. So what the problem is, again, this is a situation where law enforcement, which is not addressing the crime problem, is saying, give us more tools, as if that will make up for the multitude of tools that they already are choosing not to apply in these cases, will somehow change their decision making, when What we have to do is change their decision making. And that's a matter of leadership and a matter of making sure that we have a national strategy that recognizes this threat. Again, this idea that just acknowledging that white supremacy is a problem when the violence from these groups has been persistent throughout the history of the United States. This isn't something new. This is something that occurs on a regular basis. It just targets populations that typically don't have the kind of powerful political platform that members of Congress have. So, it's nice to hear officials talk about having their awareness raised about this issue, but that was the same rhetoric we heard after the violence at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, right? That we have to make sure we're actually holding our public officials to account, and particularly our law enforcement officials, that they're actually going to do something to focus on this violence and address the violence.
Yeah, and this would not apply at all to far-right violence. Whenever someone mentions a lack of domestic terrorism laws, I feel obligated to mention that Congress passed an Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, right? A law specifically aimed at supposedly what is animal enterprise terrorism. DRAD was very involved in opposing that. We still are opposed to it, but the steam there is slightly gone. And the main thing it's been used for are people who free mink from fur farms, which is a major act of terrorism plaguing our nation. Mike, when I see these former FBI agents on TV who are not you, clearly, the thing they always sort of talk about is how in the foreign terrorism context, you have the State Department Foreign Terrorism Organization list, and they can charge people with material. I heard people on CNN say this blank, right? And they oftentimes misexplain the law in troubling ways,
right.
But they can go and charge someone with material support for a foreign terrorist organization, and they bemoan the fact that there is no sort of list of prescribed domestic organizations that they can then go and charge people for providing material support for. How terrible of an idea would a sort of domestic equivalent to the FTO law be?
So it would actually be as terrible as it is in the foreign terrorist organization context, right? I mean, the people who promote this idea act as if that statute was very effective against foreign terrorist groups. In fact, it's the opposite. Hamas was the first foreign terrorist group designated. That was in 1996, right? They have since been elected as the government of in the Palestinian territories. So again, it's this false notion that this is an effective methodology. Al Qaeda was designated in 1998. They've done pretty well since then. ISIS didn't exist when all this started. That we have to understand that the concept behind that law was that if we could choke off financial support to these groups, they would wither and die. But that's not been the case, the opposite. And part of that is the law itself, that's not really how terrorist groups function. And they don't need that kind of broad support because their terrorism is locally funded. But also that to the extent you find any sort of serious funding for these banned groups, that isn't punished very severely. So when it's major banking institutions that are caught without the proper money laundering and anti-terrorism regulations in place or practices in place, what you see instead is targeting people who are at the very end of the spectrum. Somebody who sent a pair of socks to their buddy who happened to join one of these groups. That's not going to be a very supportive of the terrorism enterprise. So it's not been effective, and it's easily been abused because it's what started this concept of these very theatrical sting operations, where the FBI is not targeting people in terrorist groups who are committing terrorism, but rather people who are saying things they don't like, who then they recruit into a fake terrorist organization so they can then charge them with a crime. And that's not actually, that produces a statistic that the FBI argues justifies its programming, but it's actually not addressing a terrorism problem. And in the domestic context, it totally misunderstands how these groups operate, right? These groups change names like we change clothes, right? As soon as somebody in a group does something that makes the group look bad, they abandon that name and reorganize under a different name. So as soon as a name got put on a list, they would simply change the name. So it would never be an effective methodology in the first place. It's not effective in the manner that we use it today. Why we'd want to completely replicate a failed program is astonishing to me that that's even discussed in the counterterrorism context.
But to be a bit provocative, don't you think there's a case that the law has in some way succeeded in what it set out to do, and that it's been used very heavily to repress especially Arab American civil society groups like the Holy Land 5 Foundation? And when you trace it back to some of its original proponents in the 80s, it's groups like the Heritage Foundation, who the big problem there, the big terrorist problem they're facing with are groups that are supporting people in Latin America who do not want to live under governments we've installed for them, right? And in that sense, it was designed to repress speech, and it has done an excellent job at that.
Absolutely, and that's what I mean. It's neither effective in actually addressing real terrorism violence that government should be focused on, and is instead easily abused. And you mentioned the Holy Land case, where the government never alleged in that case that the Holy Land supported Hamas directly or even indirectly. You know, the government theory in prosecuting the Holy Land was that any support to the Palestinian territories by osmosis aid Hamas, because then they don't have to spend money buying backpacks for kids to go to school, as if that's what they were going to do. Right? I mean, it's an astonishingly specious argument to make, and yet that argument held up in the Supreme Court, and we're in the situation we're in. But again, that didn't stop Hamas from engaging in terrorism or impede them in any way. In fact, it gave them a greater justification because it was evidence that they were unfairly targeting Palestinian activists and Palestinian humanitarian organizations, that then made it, you know, an easier argument for them to say why violence was necessary to address their concerns. So it's a completely counterproductive use of the law that does harm on society, but doesn't actually repress any actual terrorism.
And if I could just add one other piece, you know, about the Arab American Muslim and the Muslim community in particular, you know, law enforcement need, you know, Arab Americans and Muslims in order to really genuinely stamp out actual threats, right? Mike was talking about, you know, these contrived operations that are really driven by the FBI, and they're sort of almost entrapment type situations. But there are some people who are genuine threats, right? Who have been, you know, recruited by Al Qaeda and ISIS, and the only way to really get those people out and to really get them prosecuted and to keep them away so that, you know, we are not harmed by them is through working with the community. And with these types of policies, while you're right, Chip, do suppress speech and really do crush movements that are trying to, you know, bring up justice and for Latin America, for Palestine, racial justice, etc. They actually also crush the law enforcement and community relationship, which is vital for genuine security to happen at the community level. And that's and even the FBI has acknowledged this. In my work in Pittsburgh and in other communities, I've met with FBI agents in charge where I've told them, you keep going to these communities and asking them questions and harassing them, they're not going to work with you anymore. And we actually tell the communities, you should not trust the FBI because they're abusing their power and it's not right. So that actually ends up hurting us in the long term. You're right that tactically it might make sense, but strategically in the long term, it makes us less safe. And we have a bigger, you know, terrorism problem today than we ever did on 9/11. And that's because of a lot of our reactions to what happened, the horrible attacks on 9/11, including this massive surveillance state that has, you know, pushed people underground and has not allowed for healthy debate.
So those are all excellent points. We have a little bit of time left, and I want to go to final thoughts from each of the panelists. Arun, what are your final thoughts this afternoon you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I think one of the big things is just treating criminals as criminals. 5 years ago exactly, I was at the Bundy occupation in Malheur, Oregon. And so, when we talk about like the mink farms and terrorism, these guys who are, I think are essentially, certainly white supremacists, Clive and Bundy, their father mused about like, blacks were probably better when they were slaves. They were just allowed to operate with impunity. After that standoff, where we saw these militiamen training rifles at federal law enforcement, the Bundys then went around and their supporters trying to instigate more violent confrontations. They did it at a mine in Southern Oregon. They did it at a canyon in Utah. They did it at another mine in Montana before they finally settled on Malheur, Oregon. And what they were doing was defending two ranchers. And the thing is, if you look at the story of those two ranchers, who, by the way, Trump recently pardoned, Dwight and Stephen Hammond, they were engaging in all this criminal activity as well. They were destroying the refuge with their cattle. They were. I talked to the Fish and Wildlife officials who allege that they were doing illegal aerial hunting in the refuge. They were doing arsons. They were threatening to kill members, Fish and Wildlife employees, in very graphic terms, and killed their children. And they were allowed to do this for decades, just as Clive and Bundy was allowed for 20 years to illegally graze on public lands before the feds finally intervened. And then if we fast forward to what we see in Portland, we just see this complete impunity. And I'll just point to one thing in Portland. We can put up some of my reporting on the, on our website from The Intercept, from Jacobin and Raw Story. But most recently in August, you had essentially Proud Boys and Patriot Prayers come to fight anti-fascists. And the Portland police, while there's all this violence going on by the far right, they're openly attacking people right around the corner. I mean, within spitting distance of the police headquarters in front of the sheriff's office, the police are saying, well, we're not going to intervene because, police yourselves. We're too tired of, this is what they actually stated. We're too tired of policing protests. And it doesn't look like there's any sustained fighting going on. And meanwhile, this Proud Boy, Alan Swiney, is pointing a loaded gun at people. And he's allowed to basically hang out in Portland, even though they're reporters there from even the New York Times who are reporting this. So there's just complete impunity for this criminal activity. And the final thing is, we have to remember that the Bundys got off twice, including on conspiracy charges, because I think the embeddedness of white supremacy in our culture, that a jury acquitted them of conspiracy to take over Malheur and using force to prevent employees from working there, because they saw them as sympathetic cowboys. And so this, to me, I think it does presage, potential problems for the prosecution of the Capitol Hill insurrectionists. If they're able to stack the juries, as they were able to do in Portland, with people who are sympathetic to conservative whites, you'll see people getting off on these conspiracy charges.
That might be hard with DC juries. I know probably one of the biggest uphill battles they had with DJ-20 prosecutions was just that no DC jury was going to ever convict any of those people. That was Arun Gupta, who is an independent journalist and DRAD board member. We also had him on our Lunchtime Live segment, which you can find on our YouTube channel, to talk about what's going on in Portland more broadly. I know Iman has to go, so I want to give her a chance to share her final thoughts, and then I will go to the rest of the panel for their final thoughts.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm sorry I have to run, but I just wanted to thank you again, Chip, and thank all of my colleagues for the incredible work you're doing. Investigative journalism is really a rare species. in this day and age, as are, FBI whistleblowers with integrity. So I thank all of you, and really, I'm honored to have been in this robust and important discussion. And if anybody has any questions about, domestic terrorism, how to combat white supremacy, and also how to make sure that we have a criminal legal system that works for all Americans, feel free to, shoot me an email at, my last name is really long, so I can put it in the chat, and I'm sure Chip can share it. And just thank you, and please be safe.
Thank you so much, Iman, for joining us. That was Iman from the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. Alice, what final thoughts would you like to share us with?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we're, at a really delicate time where, people are really angry and scared and like rightfully like want to see some accountability and want to see some action. But I think we have to be really careful about what happens next. I mean, we've already seen just since January 6th, 14 bills, anti-protest bills proposed in, I think 10 states across the country and more coming. And these are bills that, were not written after January 6th. These are bills that were written after the George Floyd uprising, after protests before that, and that legislators had been trying to push through, and they are now seeing kind of like an opening to do that. We saw the Biden administration that just came in, and I think today actually announced that they are going to take all the steps to combat domestic extremism, as they called it, and I think we just have to kind of make sure that we watch that and kind of unpack that and ask what that means. And like what we talked before about Black identity extremism and, this kind of like made up label that the FBI came up with in response to the Ferguson uprising. And, I think a couple years ago, if I'm correct, largely in response to the backlash and the criticism that the FBI faced over the BIE label, they kind of collapsed all these categories, right? And they put everything together under what they called racially motivated extremism. And they did something similar with anti-government extremism. And basically what they did by creating these like big umbrellas is just like hiding all the work they're doing so that it becomes really hard for, journalists, but also legislators and everybody else to actually know what is it that you're doing under this domestic extremism label? What is it that you're doing under this racially motivated extremism label? Are you targeting Black Lives Matter protesters? Are you targeting people of color? Are you targeting police critics, or are you targeting white supremacists, right? We have no way of knowing that. And so, we started talking about language, and I think a lot can be hidden in this category is that government is, very good at kind of creating and reinventing and adapting to sort of create the illusion that they're doing something differently. But, we really have no way of knowing.
I finally got from a congressional office the FBI definition of anti-government, anti-authority extremism. It is a real, by all the FBI terrorism definitions, it is a real interesting read. It's something along the lines of opposition to, because it's always perceived social, economic, or political or racial hierarchies, as well as opposition to government overreach and opposition to government neglect. So too much government, not enough government. What's the right, so like Goldilocks level of government here? And I would note that this is the label that Barr used on the task force that he opened up in response to the George Floyd protests. They started a task force on anti-government, anti-authority extremism. And when you look at the definition, I mean, it's funny to say, political, social, economic hierarchies. That's a very broad definition. And I would be terrified to know what exactly the Barr task force is doing. And it would be great if Merrick Garland would come in and disband it, though we will see. That is Alicia Sperry from The Intercept. You can also find her on the Still Spying podcast, where I talk to her about how journalists today expose FBI surveillance. And then last but not least, Mike.
Well, thanks again, Chip, for inviting me and to my co-panelists. I really appreciate all the work that you do. And for the audience, I think I'd want to leave them with one last thought, which recognizing that while law enforcement is one government institution that's infected with white supremacy, and that produces unfair outcomes, that it's not the only one. But we have to separate what is a law enforcement function, which is to address the violence and the criminality of these groups and individuals, and what is for the rest of us, which is to address how white supremacy is still a part of our culture and our politics, and that we need to understand how that operates and drive it out. But we don't want law enforcement to be operating in that space, because what we've seen over and over again is that isn't what they end up targeting. So while we have a lot of work to do as a society to understand how white supremacy harms our society, just as it has since its creation, let's make sure law enforcement is focused. And I'll just highlight something Arun said in the chat, that if law enforcement starts taking action on this violence, it will reduce the level of the violence, right? And as he suggests in the chat, what the FBI had warned about planned attacks around the country didn't come to fruition. And part of that is because the people who have been conditioned over the last 4 years that they can come out in public and commit public violence without interference are now realizing that there might be ramifications. So, we have to make sure that there's plenty of violence for law enforcement to focus on here, rather than trying to police ideologies. Let's let them focus on the violence.
And that is Mike German, author of Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide, How the New FBI Damages Democracy. Also a fellow at the Brennan Center. Thank you. And you can find Mike as well on the Still Spying podcast, and what I think is our longest episode. Mike and I talk about.
I'm long-winded. I'm sorry.
No, I think it is. I think it's both of our thoughts for that one. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And if you're interested in future events with Defending Rights and Dissent, I have an exciting announcement for you. On Tuesday at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, we will be hosting an event called Fred Hampton, The Fight for Truth. Fred Hampton was a Black Panther who was murdered in a Chicago police raid that was orchestrated by the FBI as part of its counterintelligence program. You might be wondering why we're talking about that. Well, just this week, new documents in the killing of Fred Hampton have come out showing that J. Edgar Hoover himself might have been involved in it. And we will be having Flint Taylor and Jeffrey Haas, who were the lawyers for Hampton during his life and led the legal representation of the survivors of the raid and were the parties who were most responsible for bringing out the FBI's role in it. And they are still fighting for the truth for Fred Hampton, and we are happy to highlight and uplift their work. And if you want to register for that event, go to rightsanddissent.org/Fred Hampton. I'm very excited for that. And thank you, Mike, Arun, and Alicia for joining me. And thank you, everyone at home who watched. It's always a pleasure to do these.
Thanks.
Thank you.